Hello, my name is Ozella Brundage and I'm a student at Walden University and I'm in the program, the PhD program for early childhood education. This particular project is the Knowledge Area Module 5 and it's the application section. Now, I am doing a series on the language acquisition from a neurological perspective, and I've already done part 1, which is a classical language learning theories. More so, they are aphasia studies from the 1800s, and also brain anatomy, basic brain anatomy. That's part 1. And part 2 is on the perceptual development of pre-linguistic or literary skills. Now, we are going to look at part 3 today, and that's the Warnix area. The Warnix area is responsible for language comprehension, and it's located in the posterior area of the superior temporal gyrus. And I encourage you to look at part 1 to get an understanding of the brain anatomy. Okay? But this is where the Warnix is located. Okay? Now, the Warnix is one of the most important areas of the brain of language learning, along with the Broca. The two of them are very, very significant in language learning. Okay, so I already mentioned where it's located, and I have it in this area right here on this particular diagram. Warnix is responsible for phonological processing and also for phonological discrimination. And what we mean by discrimination is when there's noise, or I would say sounds in the environment, and the Warnix area will discriminate the sounds and separate the sounds and pull out the language or linguistic sounds. Okay? Now, it is also responsible for decoding phonemes and then decoding the words. And when I say decoding the words, I mean converting the words into plain language, okay? Something that could be understood. And the same thing with phonemes, putting it together with things that can be understood or information that can be understood. Okay, the Warnix is responsible for visual cognition. Since we're talking about language acquisition, so here we're talking about the understanding of letters, understanding of the syllables and words and prefixes and all of what can be seen, printed letters and symbols. Okay? The Warnix is responsible for understanding written language. So when the child is reading, Warnix is being activated when the child is starting to understand what is being presented on paper. Okay? Now, the Warnix area is also responsible for verbal abilities. While listening to someone speak and also speaking and communicating back and forth, those are verbal abilities, and Warnix is involved with that process. Speech comprehension is responsible for understanding speech during a verbal conversation or when someone is talking. Also, what's important during a speech or a conversation, short-term memory is necessary. Warnix will hold information for a short period of time and then respond to it and communicate and just continue and able to continue a communication. I like to put it that way. Okay? Now, there's a large group of things that the Warnix is responsible for, the cognitive performances. And there's more than what I have here, but what I'd like to do is just show it to you. The receptive language processing. Now, receptive language processing is very significant because we have it where it's following directions verbally and also in writing. understanding stories, when we're reading stories to our children. And we want the kids to be able to understand what's going on. And what happens is the Warnick is being activated while you're reading to your children. How about figurative language? We need the Warnick functioning well in order for this to occur, or for the students to develop the skills. Okay? Now, Warnick is responsible for semantic cognition as a whole, okay? Verbally and also in writing, and just understanding all concepts. The Warnick is involved with that, understanding meaning. Now, syntactic comprehension. Now, Warnick is involved with this, and I would say that it's knowing the linguistic rules of a culture, the cultural language. I would also say that most likely we're dealing with subcultures, okay? Like, for instance, African Americans, we have subcultures. Depending on the part of the country that we are in, there are rules of communication. So we have a syntactic comprehension, and then in that case the Warnick is functioning. Also, other areas and dialects of people from all over the country, and I would say the world. Okay, so we have lexical representations that are in the Warnick area. So lexical, we mean the words. So the words are present in the in the Warnick area to be used. Okay, in the ways that I mentioned. Now, what I'd like to do, since we starting off, I just ended with the lexical representation, we should look at the planum temporal. The planum temporal is located within the Warnick area and towards the top, and I'm going to show you an fMRI that will point that out. Now, what happened here is McWhinney, he stated that lexical items carries out a central controlling and stabilizing role in learning and also in processing language. And so the lexicon is very important that we help young children develop the lexicon. And remember, the lexicon is, these are words that children have come in contact with, not knowing the meaning. It doesn't mean these are groups of words, and meaning is not related to it. It's just like a bank of words. Now, what I'd like to show you in this particular slide is the difference between the left and the right hemisphere. Now, we always say that the left hemisphere is language dominant, and what we see now is we're able to put a picture to what we're talking about. Look how large the planum temporal is compared to, in the left side, compared to the right side. Okay, so what's happening, we still have the same thing happening and functions on the left and the right side of the brain. It's just we're dealing with the activation level, the amount. Okay, in this case, the amount of words that a person knows. Okay, so I already mentioned that it stores the lexicon, the planum temporal stores the lexicon, and also the planum is involved with auditory processing. Okay, now if we look here, we can see that the proximity of the ear, of the auditory system, along the same, the diagram is not here, but it's along the temporal gyrus, and as we go across, and then we can see that it's all connected or in close proximity. Okay, so phonological coding of speech sounds. And I have here that we combine and categorize spoken sounds, and what we're doing is we want to correlate them precisely into the cognitive areas that perform related functions. And it's a jumbling of words, but what happens is things are precise. When we are speaking and we're talking, we're using various cognitive areas in our brains to bring forth the message or to understand the speech that we're listening to. It's responsible for processing grapheme phonemes, okay? And also, in the part 2, we talked about the visual word form area is responsible for processing grapheme phonemes as well. Okay, it is developed by the Broca. Now, we want to look at the planum temporal as a holding place. It does not deposit the words in itself. What happens is the Broca builds it and basically does that. And when we get to that area, I'll speak more on it. Okay, now here I have an fMRI, okay? This is an fMRI, and what I'd like to do is outline the brain. Sometimes when we're looking at these images, they're kind of hard. We have to get used to deciphering them. Here you see the gray matter. This right here is the brain, okay, as a whole. This is the brain. Now, the planum temporal is inside the Wernicke, which is in the temporal lobe. So I want to outline the temporal lobe here. You see, this is the entire temporal lobe, okay? And it's like this, the oval shape. And this is where the planum temporal is located. There's activation in these areas, okay? So we have this, we understand that. But we have spatial activation patterns occur in the planum temporal, okay? When a child looks at words while reading, there are spaces in between each of the words. There are certain shapes of the words where the child can read over common words such as the, is, to, and also we look at double, like for instance, two L's together, and the child's able to read that, and they're developing a pattern of reading and over the page. Now this is important because the planum temporal supports the sensory motor integration of speech, because we're doing the oral reading task, of the vocal tract, we're speaking and pronouncing words, and also eye movement as you read across the page. So the planum temporal works on all of these and integrates them. Now, it's not doing this on its own, okay, but this is where there's some that's working along with, and I mentioned the Broca earlier, okay. Now, we want to complete the concept or the idea. We want to look at this temporal lobe. We might as well combine some of the other areas with our lesson here. Okay, so the left middle temporal lobe is for verbal knowledge. When you are talking and hearing, we're not talking about in writing, written work, but in conversations. There's a buildup of knowledge in this mid-temporal gyrus. This, we have been talking about the superior. In the second part, I talked about the inferior fusiform area, the visual word form area, okay? So now this mid-temporals, we see that grapheme phoneme decoding occur in the mid-temporal gyrus, verbal knowledge as mentioned above here, lexical semantics. And I want to go back because we want to deal with the lexicon. In this particular diagram, it would be located here in this area. The Wernicke is located in this area. Lexicon is on top of it. But note, lexical, the words, semantic, understanding. So what happens is the mid-temporal gyrus takes the information, takes the words, and begin to understand it, okay? Bring meaning to the word, okay? Also obtain semantic information from the sound to meaning network. And what I want to do is show you, and basically these would be the white matter fibers, which we talked about, in the previous parts. I think that's going to be part 1 of this project. Now here we would have semantics, okay, and actually both sides of the brain, the right and the left hemisphere in this area. And then we have the sound. This is the auditory center located here. Then we have the Wernicke's area, which is also responsible for semantics. And then inside we have the lexicon. So you can imagine strings of fibers that are connecting on this particular, the superior temporal gyrus, and then also now we want to include the mid-temporal gyrus. So when it says that there's a connection, it is connected to that sound auditory meaning network. So the meaning we have here and now here. Okay? So what I'd like to do is let's look at 2 of the areas that we look at 2 of these areas in language processing of the temporal lobe. Okay, the Wernicke's area. Okay, we located the Wernicke's area. We know that it's for language comprehension, and now we found that receptive language processing occurs in the Wernicke's area as now. Important concepts. Then we have the planum temporal, okay, and then this is where the lexical information is stored, the words are stored, okay, and then it's responsible for the grapheme phoneme processing, and grapheme would be the shape of the letters, okay, I should say, and then phonemes, the sound. Okay, so this right here is just a little piece that I wanted to put together for you. Okay, now I'm not going to go over this entire chart, and I do encourage you to go back and look at this presentation and pause it and read over the skills that we see here. But what I want to point out to you is that here we have the temporal lobe, the skills of the temporal lobe that are not repeated and overlapped with in the other areas of the brain. Okay, our angular gyrus, our supramarginal gyrus, and also the Broca's area. There is no, basically once I would say the child needs to perfect and learn and develop these skills in the temporal lobe early on, okay, in, I would say, early childhood education and also, the preschool and kindergarten and in that area, in that time period. So these are the skills that we must develop, okay, and then they'll be able to be used later on in the more higher cognitive skill processing areas of the brain. And this is also basic print and reading information. And this right here, this column, is supported by other areas of the brain. Okay? Now, I also have a chart here where the still, we're looking at the temporal lobe, okay? And these are higher cognitive functions. And also, these functions are supported in other areas of the brain, okay? So, meaningful speech, understanding, lexical, all of this right here is supported in other areas of the brain. Connective tissue, we have our reading network, our writing network. All of this, they work together to develop and acquire, for the child to acquire language. Okay? So this is the end of part 3. I do encourage you to go back and look at parts 1 and 2 and join me for part 4. And I will be talking about the angular gyrus and the area in this area right here, the parietal lobe. And I especially would like for you to go back and look at the anatomy of the brain. Thank you for watching.